Back in 2014, rumors began spreading of a vicious gang working the M4 highway south of Moscow. Folks shared stories about families going on a trip never to return, only to be found dead next to an abandoned car. Maybe $50 in rubles or a smartphone was stolen, and sometimes nothing at all. Soon it made the news, with the criminals being dubbed the GTA gang after the popular video game. The reality of their crimes far exceeded even the wildest rumors, however, and the M4 wasn't their only hunting ground. The M4 is one of the most important highways leading to and from the Russian capital. Built back in the 1960s, Soviet citizens used it to get to the Black Sea for vacation. It takes you through the cities of Voronezh and Rostov-on-Don before reaching Krasnodar Krai, and from there, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to the beach. When I lived in Russia, I often drove it to visit friends several times a month, and I've even taken it almost all the way to the Black Sea, so I know these places well. Like everyone else, I was very worried when I heard the news about the murders. In addition to travelers heading south and truckers hauling cargo, the M4 is often used by residents spending their summers in the many cottage settlements, villages, and small towns sprinkled throughout the countryside. In short, it was a fairly safe and unremarkable road. Nothing special ever happened there, besides the occasional accident or fight between drivers. All that changed when a series of brutal murders started taking place, all suspiciously similar to each other. What did they have in common? The victims were found with gunshot wounds in or next to their cars, and their wheels had been punctured with something. Valuables and money were occasionally missing. Often, the attackers didn't have time to take anything, or they ended up stealing very little. Most were killed over a few $100s in rubles, a tablet, or some jewelry. They were shot at close range and had little chance to escape. Those that tried to run were found lying on the road, shot in the back. Sometimes the gang chose its victims at random, and sometimes specific people were targeted, and the victims were a very diverse lot: taxi drivers, a young couple, a Chinese citizen carrying a rather large sum of money. It didn't help that the traffic cameras on most roads around Moscow were fake, only used to scare drivers into going above the speed limit. Now let's take a look at the details of some of the attacks. On March 7, 2012, a 26-year-old taxi driver from Uzbekistan named Bahram Seytunbetov disappeared from the village of Gunusovo, and his car went missing as well. The police weren't really interested in looking for him. First of all, he was an adult, and second, he was a foreigner. They figured he probably just decided to return home after failing to make it in Russia. However, as it turns out, Bahram's car was still traveling around the Moscow region even a few years after his disappearance. On July 22nd of the same year, another ghost car traversed the M4 with Lithuanian plates. It was owned by Firuz Karakulov, another missing taxi driver. These cars now belong to the GTA gang. A few months later, the criminals cruising around in the ghost cars hit the jackpot. A Chinese citizen named Mao Chua-mei carrying 17 million rubles, or about $442,000. It was money he had earned selling furs. The thieves had obviously been tipped off. They knew perfectly well who was behind the wheel of the brand new Mercedes and what he had with him. In this case, Mao Mei's life was spared. He was severely beaten and threatened with weapons. It was said later that he had greatly understated the amount stolen for some reason. According to unofficial data, there was about 40 million rubles in the car, and the gang members used it to buy several apartments throughout Russia. The next incident on the M4 happened in the summer of 2013. The GTA rarely committed crimes in cold months, finding it too difficult. The victim this time was 30-year-old Andrei Zorin, an auto mechanic at a Mercedes dealership. He had gone for a ride with Yulia Baronova, a saleswoman. It was something they often did. They would chat and make love in the car. She survived the attack but was seriously injured. The next move by the gang was in the neighboring Kaluga region, also along the M4. They attacked some Azerbaijani businessmen, stealing 300,000 rubles or $10,000 from them, but leaving them alive. The police arrived at the scene only an hour later, after the victims had already left for the hospital. They never even opened a case because the perps had not been caught on camera, and again, the victims were foreigners. For a while, they would rob drivers who stopped on the side of the road or drove off onto a side road, but that didn't happen all that often, and it was a time-consuming endeavor. In November 2013, the gang decided to try a new tactic. They started stopping cars themselves using homemade spike strips with curved nails. They also expanded their geography, spreading their hunting grounds to the M9 highway. Here's how a friend of one of the victims described it. I planned to go fishing with Eddie and our mutual friend Pasha on Monday, November 11th, at Rybinsk Reservoir. We were going to each take our own cars for convenience. Eddie called me at about 3:30 a.m. on November 11th and said that he was driving on the M9 and would be in about half an hour. However, after 15 minutes, he called back and said that he had a flat tire, so he would be late. After another 15 minutes, he called and said that he had forgotten his jack and no one was stopping, so he asked me to bring one. That's when Pasha also called me and I told him about it, and I suggested that he go to Rybinsk Reservoir on his own. Eddie and I would catch up with him. At 4:20, I pulled up to Eddie's car, which was on a concrete road with his hazards on, and gave him the jack. Then I went home to load everything into my car. By 5:30, Eddie still hadn't arrived, and he wasn't answering his phone, so I went to find him. At 6:20, I found Eddie's car in the same place with an open trunk, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked around with my flashlight and saw that he was lying a few meters from the car in a ditch with blood flowing from his head. I immediately called the police. Businessman Eduard Mikartumov, who together with his wife, bred and sold exotic aquarium fish, did not go fishing that day. The highway robbers got away with his laptop, $1,300 in rubles, and 2 mobile phones. A witness had seen 2 cars next to Eduard's, but unfortunately they didn't remember their make or color. The spike strips had been removed by the criminals, who had waited 2 whole hours before attacking to avoid witnesses. Just 2 weeks after this massacre, they struck again. A businessman named Alexander was ambushed right outside his house in Moscow's Biberovo district as he walked to his car carrying a bag containing about 98,000 rubles, or about $2,500. The attackers beat him about the head, attempting to take the money. "Give me the bag or I'll kill you," shouted one of the attackers. Alexander handed it over. The robbers fled and got into their car. On November 28th, just 3 days after that attack, they shot 3 young people sitting in a car doing drugs. One of the men, Ilya, miraculously managed to survive and made it back to his home city of Ryazan in an attempt to save his friends. However, they did not survive. One of them, Yevgeny, died on the spot from 5 gunshot wounds. The second, Pavel, also hit 5 times, died on the operating table from blood loss and shock. Ilya, who had been behind the wheel, was lucky. A bullet was removed from his hand, but the ones meant for his head only left scratches. In total, the attackers fired about 15 to 20 shots at the car, but before they could take anything of value, a truck drove by and they were forced to hide. The GTA gang was furious. 3 people had been shot and they ended up with no money. A week later, they committed their most high-profile crime, apparently deciding this time they would make sure they got at least something. Their ambitious target was the foreman of the Lysina-Ostrovska commodity park, and they ended up killing 4 people. Hoping to get away with millions of rubles, they managed to steal only some old sweatpants, t-shirts, and underwear. The manager had been very late that day and didn't bring the money on time, which saved his life. All the dad who had been sitting quietly at a table drinking tea were identified immediately. The bodies of 3 were taken by relatives, and the 4th was buried in an unmarked grave. The whole deal with the GTA gang really shines a light on how many unskilled laborers subsist in Moscow. The vast majority having arrived from other regions, having burned all their bridges with any relatives, and many simply have nothing to lose, making them very vulnerable. After another failed attack, the gang hid out for several months, summoning up the courage to commit a new crime only in February 25th of 2014. This time, bank founder Vladimir Kirilluk, a resident of the elite village of Monteville on the M9, was the unlucky victim. That evening, despite the call, he set off on a bicycle, leading his dog. After leaving the territory of the village, he was jumped. His body was found by his wife, who had run out to look for her husband after the dog returned home alone. There were 8 gunshot wounds and 25 knife wounds on his body, but it was a control shot to the head that killed him. During the forensic medical examination, a fragment of a makeshift silencer was removed from his eyelid. Kirilluk had been looking straight into the barrel of the gun he was killed with. The next victims on the M4 were the Lebedevs, a retired couple. A total of $1,300 in rubles and a tablet were stolen from their car. During the investigation, the police found 3 spike strips in a ditch near the road. There were no witnesses to the incident. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they had been alone on the road. In June 2014, the gang decided to deal with Oleg Tolmachov, knowing perfectly well he was a cop. Here's how his wife recalled it.
On June 4th, 2014, Oleg returned from work at about 7:30 p.m., changed into civilian clothes, washed his uniform, and sat down to dinner. Soon someone called him, and they talked about official business. Around 10, he left the house. I put our son to bed, and at about 11, I went for a walk with my friend Natalia. As we were outside, Anatoly, my lover, called me, and I asked him to come over. He took us to the lake, where the 3 of us sat for about 15 minutes. After which, we took Natalia home, and we drove to a parking lot near our house and sat in the car. Anatoly parked his car in front of the fence. At about 1:30 a.m., I was about to go home, but then Oleg's Mitsubishi Lancer drove into the parking lot, and I decided to wait. Anatoly and I saw Oleg walk towards the exit from the parking lot, followed by 3 men. When Oleg was at the very gate, about 20 meters from me, one of the men caught up with him and tripped him. My husband fell, and then the second one shot him at least 3 times. After that, the unknown man turned to leave, but Oleg grabbed his own head, and one of them returned and fired 2 more shots. Then the 2 other unidentified men grabbed Oleg by the legs and dragged him towards the bushes, near the exit from the parking lot. I tried to get out, but Anatoly grabbed my hand and said, "They'll kill any witness. Sit." Then I called an ambulance and my neighbor, and told her what had happened. Since her husband is also a police officer, he immediately called it in. When the ambulance arrived, Anatoly and I first went to the doctor's, and then I went to Oleg's car. It was open, and documents were scattered around inside.
Anatoly may have saved her life that day. Items worth only 5,000 rubles, or about $130, had been stolen from Oleg's car. At the end of June, the gang shot a taxi driver named Alexei Tsiganov. The police found a spike strip near the scene. A month and a half later, they struck again. This time, their target was a dancer named Albert Yusupov, who was spending time with his friend Alexander that day. Here's how Alexander describes it. On August 17th, my wife Maria and I took my friend Albert Yusupov to visit my in-laws at their country house near Lukhovice. We spent the day examining plots of land because Albert and I both wanted to build houses there for ourselves. We had dinner in the evening and he went back to Moscow at about 1:15 a.m. However, at 2:07 he called me on my cell phone and said that not far from the exit from the Ryazan highway, near the highway patrol post, his front right wheel exploded and he asked me to bring him a wheel brace and a jack. My wife and I went to help him. I called him at 2:57, but he didn't answer. I arrived to where he was supposed to be at around 3:30, and there were 2 police cars, several civilian cars, and a man truck with its hazards on. As I passed them, I noticed Albert's Opel parked on shoulder, and then I saw a body lying on the road in a pool of blood surrounded by people both in uniform and in civilian clothes. I stopped, approached the body, and in the headlights, I could see it was Albert. After calling his friend, Albert had sat in the front seat of his car and played a game on his phone. All this time, he was being watched by members of the gang. They waited until there were no cars on the highway before quietly approaching his car and opening fire. One of the bullets pierced his carotid artery, but Albert managed to run out of his car and attempt to hide along the road. After a few meters, however, he fell in the median strip and died from blood loss. The killers had no time to steal anything. A trucker stopped on the road. They ran off, taking the spike strip they had used and dropped it nearby to be found by the police the next morning. By now, Moscow was abuzz with news about these attacks, but there were no suspects or any statements of significance from the police. The investigation continued, but to no avail. However, there were survivors, people whom the gang did not have time to kill or decided not to kill for some reason. For example, Alexei Pronin was driving at night along the M4 from Tambov with his wife and 6-year-old son. They didn't want to travel at night, but they couldn't make it to Moscow before sunset. Suddenly, the rear wheel of Pronin's car was pierced. They had run over the gang's spike strip. His wife realized that they were victims of the GTA and started crying, covering her son with clothes to try and hide him. That's when a silver Russian-made car stopped next to theirs, but it quickly drove off. Almost immediately, a truck had pulled up behind them, saving the family. The criminals disappeared when they saw the witnesses. The GTA gang committed its last crime on September 3, 2014, and it turned out to be their greatest failure. Not only did they not manage to steal anything, the victims remembered their faces well. It marked the beginning of the end. There were finally working surveillance cameras at the scene of the crime, and the police managed to trace a mobile phone used by one of the gang members. Although the SIM card had no name registered to it, the phone could be tracked. All that was left was to arrest them. The police weren't the only ones on the lookout. A controversial Russian blogger named Eric Davidovich also decided to join the search. He, along with his acquaintances and friends, drove around the M4 at night, stopping cars that he thought looked suspicious. His help didn't bring any concrete results, but he created the appearance of action, positioning himself as Moscow's Batman and attracting the attention he so desperately wanted. Surprisingly, these crimes were revealed to be connected only in 2014, after shell casings found at the scenes were analyzed. In that year, investigators finally learned that the same firearm with a silencer was used in all the crimes. On November 6, 2014, after the discovery of cell phone data and an analysis of eyewitness testimony, a cottage near Moscow belonging to Alexei Staroverov, a manager at the General Prosecutor's Office of Russia, was raided. The police detained the leader of the GTA gang, but Alexei himself seems to have had nothing to do with the crime spree. He simply owned the place where they were living, and Alexei ended up resigning of his own volition. However, he wasn't so squeaky clean himself, it appears. His wife, Nadezhda, owned a business with a woman named Natalia Strishnya, who was married to the leader of another notorious gang responsible for a gangland massacre in 2010. Was Staroverov really ignorant about who was living on his property? That question remains open. The raid resulted in a shootout, and the suspected leader was killed, but not before he managed to call his accomplices, which made it all that easier to find them. The man considered the crime boss was Ibaidullah Subhanov. He was an unskilled laborer living in an annexed building with his family in the small village of Udelnya near Moscow. Those who knew him spoke well of him. He was helpful and polite, but at some point his attitude to work changed and he started goofing off. That's when he seemed to get the idea to start a gang. All the other members, and there were about 14 of them, knew Ibaidullah under the name of Rustam Usmanov. They all used nicknames. The gang also included his brother Holik, and other men from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Their goal from the very beginning was to commit robberies. The initiation rite into the gang was murder. Some potential members of the group, after learning from Subhana what was expected of them, quickly left Moscow, hoping that he would never find them. One of the bandits, Timur, described the initiation as follows. Before formally joining the gang, Rustam, Sheikh Subhanovs, and Akmal taught me how to convert non-lethal pistols into lethal ones and make silencers, as well as hand-to-hand combat and firearm handling. In May 2013, the ringleader decided to see if I could kill someone and ordered me to carry out a murder and robbery. I had to do it in the village of Mendeleevo. Maksad Barbalov went along to supervise me. For almost a month, he and I drove to the village of Mendeleevo about 8 times in total. Late in the evening of June 11th, 2013, after work, we left the car at the city limits and took off on foot. After about 40 minutes, we reached the forest belt, where we saw a dark-colored car from which music was playing. I approached the car with a pistol and saw a man and a woman in it. I couldn't make myself do it, so I returned to Justik, and he took the gun and said that he'd do everything himself and would tell Rustam that I shot them. Barbalov approached the car and fired 2 or 3 shots through the open window, and then we ran away. Each member of the GTA gang went through special training. They had to learn how to make silencers and cartridges. The future killers were taught hand-to-hand combat techniques according to a training manual written by their leader. They also had to have a legal job, and they needed to get a good reference from their employer. In the morning, most of them looked after gardens, and in the evening they went hunting. They also often prayed together, but after the arrest, no religious motive was found in their crimes, although that was investigated as a motive as well. The non-lethal pistols they converted into deadly weapons often jammed and were inaccurate. They also had 2 Kalashnikovs they never used and some kind of homemade sniper rifle. The bandits traveled in 8 cars, including the first 2 stolen from the taxi drivers they had killed. Many members of the gang just sort of fell into it. The leader had given them a loan or helped them with documents, and they, in return, had to help him commit crimes. Not all members were bloodthirsty monsters like Ubaydullah and his brother, though. For example, Zafarjan Gulamov had been a student who had stayed in Moscow without any money and a place to live. Ubaydullah took him under his wing and later demanded loyalty, providing him with weapons without even telling him how to use them. He was just supposed to scare the victims, making them follow orders. But it seemed crazy to this 24-year-old how the bandits would divide up such small amounts of money for such bloody work. For example, the equivalent of $130 taken from a corpse. Hazratxan Dadahonov, the gang's driver, had also been left without work. He had come to Moscow in 2007 with his wife and met members of the gang in 2013. His father would later come to Moscow for his trial, the first time seeing his son since he had left home. Dadahonov, however, had learned to handle his weapons and became a killer, especially when the leader of the gang was around. Many of the criminals became literally family members, marrying the sisters of their colleagues, and in their Islamic marriages, they often took on more than one wife. After they were caught, most of them, of course, claimed that only the leader of the gang had killed anyone. However, investigations proved that each of them had fired bullets from a pistol. All of them were eventually arrested, and on August 1st, 2017, they went to trial. As they were being taken to the courthouse, there were 5 of them in an elevator accompanied by only 2 guards, a woman and a man. There weren't enough guards on duty, so they had skipped the safety precautions. The perps saw their chance and decided to take it. They stopped the elevator, beat the guards to a pulp, and stole their weapons. Facing life imprisonment, they had nothing to lose. There was a shootout, and 3 of them were killed on the spot. 1 died in the hospital, and 1 survived. A negligence case was opened against the guards for not complying with safety regulations. Maybe the criminals thought that if they couldn't escape, they would rather die than go to prison. In the end, only the 4 remaining members of the gang were sentenced. Guliamov was given 20 years, and the rest received life sentences. The GTA file currently contains 150 chapters describing the atrocities committed by Subhanov and the rest. Sadder still is that so many of the crimes were committed for no reason at all, with nothing of real value being stolen. Most of the murders resulted in a half-empty wallet or a mobile phone at most. 17 people were killed by a gang of losers. A lot of people believe that the police had arrested and killed a bunch of fall guys and the real culprit got off scot-free. Case closed. In any event, the attacks stopped and people no longer fear driving along that stretch of road at night. Do you ever find yourself alone on a dark highway late at night? Do you ever get the feeling that if you pull over onto the shoulder, you may not make it home? What's your first thought when you suddenly find yourself with a flat tire? Let me know in the comments. Take care of yourself and be careful out there on the road. Stay safe.